In the Spresser Forest outside of Wittenberg, Germany, around the year 1516, a man and a few assistants came to a crossroads. It was nighttime. It was eerie. It was desolate. They wanted it that way. The man muttered some ancient words from a book he was carrying, words that his assistants wouldn't have understood. They certainly didn't mistake his intentions, though. No sooner had the ancient whisperings left his lips than the wind began to moan through the neighboring trees. The man and his assistants were no longer alone. Lightning began to flash, and thunder rumbled across the sky, and a looming figure appeared, shrouded in dark shadows. It was Mephistopheles, better known as Satan. The man had conjured up the devil, and he wanted to make a deal. He left the crossroads that night with a blood-signed contract. He also left without his soul. For the next 24 years, this man received everything that a mortal could want: love, money, fine foods, and even supernatural abilities and genius. Unfortunately for the man, his 24 years of freedom lasted all too briefly. As he retired to his room on the evening of his last night on Earth, he knew there was no chance of repentance. What was done was done. His friends and followers had gathered at the inn as well to try and protect him, but they knew his end was nigh. They waited in their rooms with hearts pounding, unable to sleep. Shortly after midnight, a violent storm descended on the inn. The wind was blowing, lightning was flashing, and above the thunder they heard their friend crying out in terror. The next morning, he was gone. His name was Dr. Johann George Faust. Ever since the legend of Johann Faust first appeared, people have been fascinated by deals with the devil, and for some reason, these Faustian myths have often been attributed to musicians. Robert Johnson, Led Zeppelin, and Avenged Sevenfold are just a few modern examples. Even the Beatles couldn't escape rumors. We're going to look into a couple of famous violinists whose careers have been steeped in Faustian controversy. Parts of these myths are ridiculous and easily refuted. Other parts? Well, we'll leave that for you to decide. This is Backstage Podcast. If you have any questions about this story or about the whole point of Backstage Podcast, send us an email at theguys@backstagepodcast.com. That's theguys@backstagepodcast.com. You can also visit our website, backstagepodcast.com, or follow us on Twitter at AskBackstage. We really do want to hear from you. For now, though, let's get started with Tartini. Giuseppe Tartini was born in Pirano, Istria, in the spring of 1692. Istria falls under Slovenian jurisdiction. It's the largest peninsula in the Adriatic Sea. 1692 was the same year as the horrific earthquake in Port Royal, Jamaica, and the same year as the Salem witch hunt, in case you were wondering. His parents enrolled him in music lessons from clerics in Pirano and Capodastria, and they ultimately placed him in a Franciscan cloister. So far, his life follows the script nicely, a musically inclined boy following his parents' wishes into the clergy. Things went off the rails pretty quickly, though. His first move was to renounce the cloister at the age of 16. Although he did retain a nominal candidacy for the priesthood, we can imagine that he may have wanted to hold on to that title as a backup option in case his escape plan didn't work out. We are now in 1708 if you're keeping track. He followed his exit from the monastery by further defying his parents' wishes and enrolling in law school in 1709 at the University of Padua. So far, this is something that any young man alive today can certainly relate to. The story's more interesting when you try and get into the mind of a young man around the turn of the 18th century, though. Not only was it much more unusual to go against family standards, he was leaving a life of stability and safety to go out into the loosely defined world of a professional musician. He was enrolling in law school, but we'll see in a minute that his studies didn't progress very far. Who knows? Maybe it was just an exploration for him before he found something more permanent. I mentioned that his law school journey didn't make it very far. Well, it looks like that may have been due to his newly acquired ability to, well, not be celibate. He made it all of 1 year without getting married. The problem is that he couldn't marry just anyone. He had to marry the protege, and in other accounts, the niece of the powerful Cardinal Cornaro. That niece, of course, was off limits to a monastery dropout like Tartini. Furthermore, he may have lied about his nominal status as an aspiring priest to make his marriage legal. The marriage was kept secret. The cardinal found out anyway. Tartini's wife's name was Elisabetta, by the way. Cardinal Cornaro was furious, as you can imagine, but unlike modern uncle-in-laws, I realize that's not really a legal family term, he actually had power to disrupt the marriage, and disrupt he did. Remember that Tartini didn't only steal the cardinal's favorite niece, or protege, depending on the account you read. He also hid his aspiring clergy status, thus providing the vengeful cardinal with 2 reasons to come after him. The cardinal ultimately prosecuted Tartini for abduction. Apparently, it didn't matter that Elisabetta wanted to be abducted, or married, depending on how you consider it, because Tartini had to leave town as fast as possible. Fortunately, he found safety. Unfortunately, or ironically perhaps, considering he had abandoned a cloister as a teenager, he ended up with the Friars Minor Conventual in Assisi. That's a monastery, by the way. He also ended up getting serious about the violin, and played in an opera orchestra there, only 2 to 3 years after leaving the music profession for law. You might find this hard to believe, but he was essentially exiled from his wife and home for several years because of an angry cardinal. He was finally pardoned in 1715 and allowed to return to his wife and to the city of Padua. In 1721, he took up a job as the principal violinist at the Basilica of Saint Antonio and lasted a full 2 years before another scandal. From 1723 to 1726, Tartini took an extended sojourn in Prague. The reason? According to Capri's account, as related in the New Grove Dictionary, he may have been running away from a paternity lawsuit by a Venetian woman. This is starting to sound like the story behind Giovanni Paisiello's marriage that we talked about in episode 1. It really is a different story, though. Nothing came of the woman's claims other than Tartini's extended stay in Prague, but her son continued to claim Tartini's paternity as late as 1767, 3 years before Tartini died. Even aside from his Devil's Trill Sonata, which we're getting to, I promise, Tartini had an excellent career. Once he was reunited with Elisabetta, the 2 of them moved to Venice, the home of the famous and eccentric violinist Francesco Veracini. He was apparently so struck with Veracini's playing that he spent a couple of years in solitary musical confinement, if you will, to improve. I think all of us musicians have had moments like that. Just when we think we're getting pretty good, we hear someone else and realize we suck. Well, anyways, this little Tartinian epiphany led him actually to become Europe's foremost violinist. Some sources say his solo career tapered off in 1740 because of a stroke, but New Grove mentioned an arm injury. Here's the interesting part. Tartini was actually an avid fencer. You know, the sport fencing. When he was back in law school, which was before he was serious as a violinist, he was actually so good at fencing that he thought he would maybe make a career out of it. I didn't even know there was such a thing in the early 1700s, but I suppose there was. Ginsberg mentioned his fencing phase much more eloquently.
At one time, it even seemed to him that fencing was his true vocation, but this was no more than the romantic impulse of a young man, and it passed with time. Tartini's logical mind and sense of purpose, together with his growing involvement in music and the violin, soon took the upper hand and helped him to realize his true inclinations and become a professional musician.
At any rate, we couldn't help but wonder if his arm injury was somehow fencing related. If so, I'm sure that was the butt of many jokes at the local violinist's pub. He maintained a busy teaching schedule as well, and considering his place as one of the forefathers of violin pedagogy, he actually started a violin school in Padua in 1728. We were lucky enough to find this letter from him to an adult student named Signora Searman. It was eventually published, and it's translated by Charles Burney.
Your principal practice and study should, at present, be confined to the use and the power of the bow, in order to make yourself entirely mistress in the execution and expression of whatever can be played or sung within the compass and ability of your instrument.
That was a gem. Let's read a couple more.
I now pass to the third essential part of a good performer on the violin, which is the making of a good shake.
I'm assuming a shake is a vibrato? This letter was signed by
your obedient and humble servant, Joseph Tartini.
I'm not sure about you, but my teachers were never quite obedient and humble enough to me. He also discovered the summation and differential tones on violin, which are sometimes referred to as Tartini tones, and he became a very prolific composer. Leopold Mozart's Violinschule of 1756 even borrowed heavily from Tartini's style. So I guess we could say that Tartini influenced Amadeus too. As far as we can tell, Tartini mostly avoided sacred music, though despite his employment at cathedrals. We really only know of 2 important sacred works from him, although his catalog is still being discovered. He very well may have developed an aversion to religion because of the years he was forced to participate in the Catholic Church. Since we are talking about Tartini as a composer, we should probably mention how the devil factors into this story. We know you've been waiting for it. Tartini's most famous piece of music by far is the Devil's Trill Sonata, or more officially, his sonata in G minor, which is much more boring, we realize. This is how Tartini's encounter with Satan goes, according to an account by a scientist alive at the time, J.J. de Lalande. This is from his 1769 publication, Voyage d'un Français en Italie. One night, Tartini dreamed that Satan was his servant. This was the result of a Faustian deal, of course, as in, Tartini had sold his soul to Satan in order to utilize him as a servant for a bit. In total music nerd fashion, Tartini used part of this borrowed time to hand Satan his violin. He asked the devil to play something. What happened next led to the very crux of Tartini's compositional life, and not just the compositional life of his dreams, but his very real and physical compositional life. The devil picked up the violin and started to play. To Tartini's amazement, the music was the most beautiful, haunting, and virtuosic thing he had ever heard. He woke up in a frenzy. As he rushed to his parchment or whatever he wrote ideas down on, he frantically tried to recall the music that he had heard in his dreams seconds earlier. Unfortunately, it was already gone. He did sit down and write a sonata anyways, and by his own admission, it was by far the greatest thing he wrote. But the real kicker? Sorry. Before I give you the real kicker, you need a little bit more info. Lalande, the scientist, had visited with Tartini to transcribe this account not long before Tartini's death. Tartini hadn't told the story before because of his employment at St. Anthony's and other religious institutions. He assumed he would be laughed at, scorned, or worse for being inspired by a dream about the devil. I guess listening to Satan as inspiration didn't go over too well in the 18th century Christendom. Not like it does today either. So all that to say that Lalande got his account from the mouth of Tartini himself, and Lalande was a scientist, so this should be pretty reputable. Now you're ready for the real kicker. Lalande wrote down that Tartini composed the Devil's Trill Sonata in 1713, when he was 21 years old. That was even before he was a well-known violinist. That's just barely after he did a stint in law school, got into fencing, and went into exile at a monastery because of his marriage. If he did in fact create his life's masterpiece so long before he reached any kind of musical maturity, I think many of us would be inclined to believe that something, from another dimension shall we say, influenced him. One explanation could include the fact that the biblical Lucifer, known as Satan of course, is described in the context of musical instruments in the Old Testament. The instruments listed with Lucifer were pipes and tambourines and stuff, but given Tartini's religious education, he could certainly have an exciting dream to that end. Another explanation might be that Tartini was haunted by his violinist role model, Veracini, who was at least slightly insane. Veracini probably haunted more than one of Tartini's dreams. Here's a quote from Charles Burney about Veracini.
He had certainly a great share of whim and caprice, but he built his freaks on a good foundation, being an excellent contrapuntist.
Burney also mentioned that Veracini was often referred to as capo pazzo, or head lunatic. Veracini also has an asteroid named after him, the 10875 Veracini, in case you wanted to know. Nightmare material indeed. Plenty of experts have challenged this account, of course. Paul Brainerd, for instance, says that Tartini couldn't have written it before 1740, given the form and stylistic choices. Others give different dates, but the truth probably lies somewhere in between. The initial idea very well may have come to Tartini in 1713, and he may have waited until later in his career to write it all out. We'll really never know. And no one seems to know where on earth the original autograph is. Of course, that could be because the original handwritten copy isn't on Earth. Maybe it's somewhere else. Tartini didn't sell his soul to us, after all. One of the reasons we love getting emails from you is that we get to share and hear your crazy music stories.
Yeah, like that time you were doing that collaborative piano gig and your music floated off the piano, magically, and settled on the floor right next to the soft pedal, and you had to lift your left foot so that you could see it. That was pretty funny. It looked like kind of a peeing dog pose.
I know, my neck was just craning to try to see the music. Oh, that was horrible. I was so horrified at that moment.
There was that other gig that I was playing for a soprano, which is already a bad start. And She handed me right before her recital that stack of 17 photocopies, all single-sided. And I got up there, and my pages were out of order.
Oh, my goodness.
It was a disaster. I don't even know what
That's
happened.
A nightmare. Yeah, and this other time, I was playing for this concert, and I flipped to the next page, and there was no more pages. And I just, panicked. They didn't give me the whole song. And so literally I made stuff up for, the next 3 minutes while the violinist just kept playing and giving me weird looks. Oh, my goodness. It was a mess.
It definitely sounds like something that I would do to you.
Yes, indeed. So if you want your story read out loud on the air, you should send us an email. We'd love to hear from you.
And you will be anonymous. We'll only use your first name. We promise.
We promise. But I'm sure all of our listeners would love to hear your experiences because I'm sure they've been in a similar situation at one point or another. Now let's get back to the story. There's another famous violinist with legends involving the underworld, and you probably know about him already. He was Niccolò Paganini. We could talk about his 24 Caprices for solo violin, Opus 1, La Campanella from Violin Concerto No. 2, and other influential music he wrote, but we'd rather focus on other things right now. You can always look him up in a thematic catalog. He was born in 1782, so some of his formative years were spent during the French takeover of northern Italy. He even played the violin in the court of Napoleon's sister during the Napoleonic rule of Italy. He started showing his reckless bent around the turn of the century, when he was 18. Honestly, that's a lot like Tartini, but that's where the similarities end. Tartini's recklessness led him to marriage and law school. Paganini's led him to a reputation as a womanizer and a gambler. Once, in 1800, he even had to pawn his violin because of a gambling debt right before a concert. Fortunately, a French merchant let him borrow a Guarneri violin, and then wouldn't take it back after he heard Paganini play. I guess addicted gamblers have to have a little bit of good luck sometimes. At that time, Paganini was only a local music hero, even national maybe, but he performed entirely within Italy until 1828, when he was 46 years old. After about 30 years of painstaking practice and refinement, he was ready to take his virtuosity outside the comforts of his homeland. He played his first international concert in Vienna in 1828 and quickly took Europe by storm. His technique and rapid rise to fame left people breathless. In line with his rumored pact with the devil, though, he had to give up performing only 6 years after the start of his international career because of debilitating health problems. Maybe the bad health that plagued him came as a result of his lifestyle, or maybe it was genetic. Or maybe there was always something more sinister at play. A deal of some kind, perhaps? Either way, it had taken him only 6 years of concertizing throughout Europe to change the world of music forever. By 1834, he was 52 now. He had grown the myth of the romantic soloist. He made virtuoso status almost supernatural. People really thought he had agreed to a Faustian deal because of his incomprehensible abilities on the violin, and because of his rapid ascent to international fame. Paganini also influenced a certain young pianist during his brief international tour. This pianist was so inspired by Paganini's ability that he set out to try and equal that virtuosity on the piano. He also tried to recreate Paganini's superstar status. You guessed it, his name was Franz Liszt. Also fascinating is the fact that Paganini commissioned and heavily supported a conductor and composer 20 years his junior named Hector Berlioz. He commissioned the work Harold in Italy, although he never wanted to play the violin part because it was too easy. He also spotted Berlioz 20,000 francs at one point and wrote that Berlioz was the next Beethoven. Paganini accomplished a lot during his relatively brief career. After his soloing ended, he tried to follow the other love of his life by opening a casino called Casino Paganini in Paris. It failed, and he lost everything. From there he moved to Nice, where he died at the age of 58. That's only the beginning of the story surrounding his death, though. If you were a particularly morbid person, you could probably look at Paganini's life as being one long journey towards death. Yes, that's what life is anyways, but his journey was a little bit more pronounced. He had a gaunt and haunted look, which was accentuated by his paleness. He certainly doesn't fit the typical description of someone who lived a rigorous and licentious lifestyle, like Franz Liszt, for instance. Many people throughout history have tried to attribute his unbelievable finger dexterity to Marfan's syndrome, which, along with all of its debilitating side effects, allows for excessively long fingers, limbs, and extra flexibility. Medical doctor Joseph Lewis has written that he couldn't have had Marfan's syndrome, though. His hands were of a normal size, and he wasn't taller than the rest of his family. What he probably did have was a mild case of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. As a result, he suffered from gastrointestinal problems throughout his whole life, a loss of eyesight in his later years, and he eventually died of internal hemorrhaging. The one good thing he got out of it was unusual and possibly grotesque flexibility in his hands. This flexibility, combined with his almost inhuman talent, probably explains the level of virtuosity he was able to reach. He was certainly better off than many other people with Ehlers-Danlos. They often had stretchable rubbery skin and became sideshows and traveling circus acts. Even with his problems, he could have had a worse life. Paganini developed debilitating respiratory symptoms around the year 1820. He was 38. He went to one particularly foolish doctor who assumed, simply because of Paganini's promiscuous lifestyle, that the violinist must have syphilis, and he prescribed a mercury remedy. Apparently, that was how doctors combated the disease in the 19th century. Doctors also tried to suppress his cough with opium. You may not be surprised to hear that his health continued to fall apart. Over the next 10 years, he became gradually worse because of the long-term mercury poisoning. He also began to show signs of tuberculosis, and as we mentioned earlier, he settled in Nice, France at the end of his life. There came a point where the Bishop of Nice sent a priest to perform the last rites on Paganini. Paganini, who probably wasn't comfortable with someone else deciding it was time for him to die, thought this move was a bit premature. He sent the priest away. 1 week later, Paganini was dead. So here we are in the story. Paganini refused his last rites because he didn't think he was dying. He ended up dead after all before the priest could return. Naturally, this didn't look good for Paganini's image, which included an alleged deal with the devil. The Catholic Church was not pleased. Paganini had refused his last rites, and therefore his soul was supposedly not prepared, nor had he been absolved from sins that he apparently needed the church's absolution from. As a result, the bishop wouldn't allow his body to be taken to his hometown of Genoa for a Catholic burial. It took 4 years, after a petition to the Pope, for his body to be permitted passage. Even after his body was transported, he remained unburied. He wasn't interred until 1876, 36 years after his death. Weirder yet, his grandson allowed a viewing of the body to Czech violinist František Ondřiček in 1893. Author Joseph Lewis wrote that Ondřiček then carried a screw from Paganini's coffin around in his case for good luck for the rest of his life. Here's a passage from Lewis's book, What Killed the Great and Not So Great Composers, describing the treatment of Paganini's corpse immediately after his death.
Paganini's embalmed body was left on the deathbed in Nice for 2 months and then transferred to the cellar of the house, remaining there for over a year. When the church refused permission for burial in his home city of Genoa, health authorities ordered the body removed. It was transported to an abandoned leper house on the coast near Villefranche, moved to a nearby cement vat in an olive oil factory, and then to a private house at Cap Ferrat, several miles from Nice.
Paganini's remains were exhumed yet again and buried for the final time in 1896 in Parma. His soul? Who knows? Maybe it walks amongst us today. You may remember Berlioz, the composer that Paganini had gifted with 20,000 francs. Berlioz named one of his most famous works The Damnation of Faust. He wrote it in the years immediately following Paganini's death, and it was premiered in 1846. It would seem that Berlioz knew something that was hidden from everyone else. Adam, you want to fill us in on what's coming next?
Yeah, I guess I could do that a little bit. We'll be looking into Shostakovich in the first half of the 20th century. It was a pretty complicated time with communism and Russian censorship and all that, so there's a lot of speculation as to whether or not Shostakovich was actually a supporter of the communist regime at the time. He was even blasted in the papers after his premiere of the opera Lady Macbeth. I believe that was 1935. The title of the article that came out in the papers was Muddle Instead of Music, which we know is bogus because it was Shostakovich. So we basically get to hear you, Justin, pronouncing a lot of Russian names. That's enough for me to look forward to.
Well, I look forward to trying. Really excited for next week's episode. It's going to be very interesting, and we're always looking for interesting stories. So if you have any that you can think of that we may have forgotten or left out, send us an email at theguys@backstagepodcast.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Backstage this week was written by Adam Gingery.
And it was narrated by Justin Blackstone. Special thanks also to Viking for the music and to Vivian Morris for the artwork. Definitely take a look at the website at www.backstagepodcast.com to learn a little bit more about them and what they do.
Would you like to get more involved with Backstage? You can find our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher Radio by searching for Backstage Podcast. Once you are there, if you subscribe to the podcast, you'll automatically get the next episode on your phone once it's available. While you're there, please leave us a review and a rating. iTunes uses those reviews and ratings to determine who gets on the featured sections, and we think it would be pretty cool to be featured on iTunes.
You can also go to our website and become a VIP by putting your email address in the box on the right part of the screen. Our VIPs get the weekly comic delivered right to their inbox, they get previews of upcoming episodes, and some exclusive commentary from us. It's well worth the 2 minutes, at least we think so.
Last, this podcast takes a lot of work from Adam and me, not to mention our collaborative artist and musician. If you want to show your ultimate support and maybe help us compensate a little bit more fairly, consider becoming a patron of Backstage Podcast. The arts have always survived in part because of the contributions of patrons. You know, patrons like the Medicis and Catherine the Great. So basically, you would be as awesome as Catherine the Great if you decide to chip in. The more you pledge per month, the more rewards and perks you get from us. Find out more at patreon.com/backstagepodcast or click on the Patreon link on the website. We'd really appreciate it.
Find all of the above and plenty of other cool content at our website at www.backstagepodcast.com. You'll be hearing another true story from us in 2 weeks. Until then, thanks for listening.